Welcome everyone. So happy you could join. My name is Winka de Wolom. I'm the Miller Professor and Chair of the Department of Architecture at the University of Pennsylvania's Weitzman School of Design. Thank you for joining us for this opening lecture this semester. And although we're not able to gather in person, we actually feel that offering our lectures on this virtual platform will allow us to connect with a broader architectural community and hence our speakers. We're glad to have you here with us tonight, and we hope you will join us for all future events, all of which are available on our website and you can register for. We're also very grateful to Ewing Cole for sponsoring tonight's events. The Ewing Cole Lecture Fund was established already in June 2002 and provides the Weitzman School with the opportunity to invite our distinguished guests and architecture lecturers. Tonight's lecture is given by Beatriz Colomina, an internationally renowned architectural historian and theorist who has written extensively on the questions of architecture, art, technology, sexuality, and media. Beatriz is also the Howard Crosby Butler Professor of History of Architecture, and Beatriz is the Director of the Graduate Studies and a founding director of the program Media and Modernity at Princeton University. Welcome, Beatriz. We're delighted to have her speak tonight and share her timely lecture, Architecture and the Pandemics, from Tuberculosis to COVID-19. Beatriz is a prolific writer and her scholarship has been published in more than 25 languages. She is the editor of Sexuality and Space 1997, which addresses gender in relation to the architectural discourse and critical theory, and that was awarded the International Book Award by the American Institute of Architects. She was the co-editor for Cold War Hot Houses, Inventing Post-War Culture from Cockpit to Playboy in 2005, which she co-edited with Anne-Marie Brennan and Jeannie Kim. Domesticity at War, published by MIT Press, was published in 2007. And Clip Stamp Fold, the radical architecture of little magazines from the 1960s to 1970s, was written by both Beatriz and Craig Buckley. And it was an amazing book that was combined with an exhibit in storefront, a really important exhibit in storefront. The book brought together a remarkable range of documents and original research, which the project has produced during its continuous travel over the 4 years, starting with the exhibit in storefront at 2006. In the 2014 Manifesto Architecture, The Ghost of Mies, came out and was quickly followed by Are We Human, written together with Mark Wrigley in 2017, and that was also part of an exhibit. Tonight's lecture doubles as a launch for Penn for her most recent book, X-Ray Architecture, from last year, published in 2019. It explores the impact of the medical discourse and diagnostic technologies on the formation, representation, and reception of modern architecture. Beatriz has curated several international exhibitions as a means to communicate her research to a wider audience by using physical installations, digital platforms, and new forms of publication. In 2016, she was the co-curator of the 3rd Istanbul Design Biennale on the theme Are We Human, which was the book I just mentioned that also came out in that context. The Design of Species, and she also, that was Are We Human? The Design of Species was one title. And she also contributed an installation on the question of social media for the inaugural Biennial of Architecture and Urbanism in Seoul, which opened in 2017. And that was great because both Simon Kim and I were there because Penn was represented at that Biennale pretty strongly as well. Both the students and Simon Kim had an exhibit. So I was really lucky to see that amazing installation that Beatriz curated. Beatriz's scholarship and research have been recognized with many awards and fellowships, including the Samuel H. Crest Senior Fellowship at the Center for Advanced Studies at the Visual Arts, SOM Foundation, the Le Corbusier Foundation, the Graham Foundation, and the Canadian Center for Architecture, the American Academy in Berlin, and the Getty Center in Los Angeles. In 2005, she received the Princeton University President's Award for Distinguished Teaching. This is an amazing accomplishment. Please join me in welcoming Beatriz Colomina to the Weitzman School. Beatriz, so happy to have you tonight, and I give you the word.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you very much for your very generous invitation. I'm of course very honored to be the inaugural lecturer in your series. Let me share the screen with you. Let's see if we can do this. Okay. Do you see it? Yeah? Okay, great. So the initial invite, as Winka already said, was actually to launch the book X-Ray Architecture, and I'm very happy to present this book to you. But of course, at the same time, it's important to note that between this invitation, this generous invitation of Winka sometime in February, I think it was, of last year, I thought to myself, nobody organizes their lecture series so much ahead of time, but Winka, there you go. So it's very important to know that between this invitation and now COVID-19 is with us, and it seems inevitable then to reframe the discussion in terms of the impact of pandemics in architecture and the city. And in fact, in the fall of last year, already I was teaching a PhD seminar at Princeton on this question, on this theme, and of course completely unaware that what seemed to us at that time, that pandemia seemed to us completely distant in, this is COVID, of course, the frightening images that we saw, those of us living in New York in the height of the pandemic, this absolutely terrifying images of people being brought out of their home and into an ambulance and into a hospital encased in these bubbles, so reminiscent of bubbles of architects of the 60s and so on. So of course this question of architecture is always present in pandemics. But when I was teaching this class to the students at Princeton, it seemed to us, of course, that pandemics were distant in time, like for example, here is cholera in Palermo in 1835, or distant in time, like like the flu of 1918. And here are some nurses in Boston, in many ways, so reminiscent of what our lives have become, or distant in space, in other continents, and all of a sudden, of course, this has become our own reality, whether it's in New York or in Melbourne, as this image happened to it. In many ways, you can argue that cities are actually always produced by medical emergencies, and that they actually leave layers upon layers of over the centuries that were in response to these pandemics. But we tend to forget very quickly what produced those layers, and in fact, we act every time as each pandemic is the very first one, many times putting in place the very same mechanisms that have been put for centuries. Of course, you know about the quarantine, which comes from the Italian quarenta, which is 40 days that ships in Dubrovnik or in Venice were asked to remain in the harbor to make sure that the plague was not invading the city, or people were asked to retreat to their spaces for 40 days. So these spaces of quarantine are very much very long, has very much a long history. In fact, one could argue that the history of cities, and I think it will be very interesting to rewrite the history of cities from that point of view, is the history of disease. cities in many ways accelerate contagion, but they also, of course, incubate. And it's very interesting that we always use these words, these medical words for ideas, no? Incubate ideas and relationship. And actually we relish this kind of contamination that they offer. And I kind of deliberately use this language as well. So despite the current wave of anti-urban sentiment, I think that far from an anti-urban force, the virus will, I think, I'm very optimistic perhaps, but I think the virus will inspire new forms of urban density, new forms of cross contamination. In fact, when we speculate about what the city of the future will be, and everybody seems to be speculating right now. I don't know how many times I've been interviewed in the newspapers in Germany or in Spain or all over, or in the UK or in Latin America about what do I think the city of the future will look like. So everybody in a crisis tends to want to know this, and the interesting thing is that most people then, particularly architects, I suppose, because we cannot help it, we think above all about the visible city, the shape, materiality, organization, streets, parks, buildings of a city. But I think what this pandemic really has demonstrated dramatically, even shockingly, is the invisible city, not just the invisible urbanism of this hyper social microorganism, but the invisible urbanism of inequities, of course, of hidden workers, right? And that now all of a sudden in the front of this pandemic, and of course uneven access to care and to empathy. So the city of the future may not look that different from the city of today, but I think the key to this city, I hope we will move into this new condition, will not be the shape of the city so much, but affordable housing and actually access to education and access to healthcare for all, which seems like a very obvious thing to say, but at the same time not clearly made it evident all the inequities and all the disasters of our healthcare system made evident in this pandemic. Anyway, modern architecture, and I did not to go back into my own research and introduce a little bit of the book. In fact, this was produced actually, and this is important in relation to this pandemic, to remember that modern architecture was actually produced in opposition to bacteria. It was produced in emergency conditions. There were millions of people dying of tuberculosis every year. If you think about what was happening globally at the end of the 19th century, 1 in 7 globally were dying of TB. And if you think about big cities like Paris, it was more like 1 in 3. So we are nowhere near those catastrophic numbers. So in many ways, modern architects responded to this call to produce an environment that was healing, and these smooth white surfaces and big openings and big expanses of glass and sun terraces actually were used primarily as instruments of health. Modern architecture, in that sense, was prescribed as a medical technology. In many ways, all these principles of design, the white walls, the smooth surfaces, the lack of decoration, the elimination of the carpets and the curtains, and all of this, didn't come from architects. It came exactly, was inherited for the sanitary reform movement that was launched in places like the UK and France in the 1830s. And spread rapidly through Europe and the United States. And it was in response to these devastating epidemics that doctors and nurses were recommending people, in fact, to modernize their houses. When you were discharged from a sanatorium, there will be these visiting nurses, and you can look into Florence Nightingale already. She's recommending that you whitewash your walls and you get rid of your carpets and your curtains because they accumulate dust, and the tuberculosis bacillus is in the dust, and you open your windows and you sleep outside and you have a simple bed and you eliminate all these knickknacks. So in many ways, nurses and doctors were modernizing architecture way before modern architects were even born. And in many ways, what the hypothesis of the book is precisely that modern architects gave shape, gave form, gave style to this medical protocol that had been long in place. And you can see in this image, which is actually the most important architectural journal at that time in Spain, the Revista Nacional de Arquitectura, is already 1952, and you can still see very clearly this association between modern white buildings with white terraces and this sick body, this X-ray of the lungs and the sun, in case anybody would have missed this connection between tuberculosis and modern architecture. And nevertheless, it was kind of a mystery for a long time. I was very surprised when writing this book, which for me started actually very early in 1980. It was my first book because it was never completed for a number of reasons that I explain in the introduction. And when I started to actually write it during a sabbatical a few years ago, really it was extraordinary to me that there were so many histories of modern architecture and nobody was reflecting on the fact that it was the result of tuberculosis. But in fact, if you go back historically, you realize that architecture and medicine has always been actually extremely interlinked. Classical theories of the Greek polis already in many ways was following theories of the four humors. And in many ways, I could argue that contemporary ideas of health are organizing still today design theories. So you have here Vitruvius, which of course these are the translations in the Renaissance in Italy, but Vitruvius in the 1st century BC already launched what we know as architectural theory by insisting that all architects should also study medicine. So just for all the students of architecture, you don't have enough studying architecture, you have to study medicine too. Why? Because health is the most important goal of the architects, and he devoted a large part of his 10 books on architecture to the question of health, giving very detailed instructions on how to choose a site for a city, sacrificing an animal that lives there and inspecting the liver to make sure that it's sound and firm, and if it is sound and firm, now you can have the city there. But likewise, he talks a lot about the health of the building, and insists that he discussed then the theories of the four humors and emphasizes the direction of the winds and the sun and all of these. And this is a very interesting moment in Vitruvius, which also has been completely unacknowledged, which when he says that in reverse, those who are not well can be cured by architecture, right? Can be cured more quickly, at least, through design, rebuilding the system of those, he says, exhausted by disease, including consumption. And of course, consumption is an old word for tuberculosis. So already in our very first treatise on architecture, Vitruvius, you already have the connection between architecture and tuberculosis. By the Renaissance, of course, despite these famous drawings of healthy bodies, whether it's Leonardo, Cesare Cesarino, the central reference for architecture, in fact, was no longer the whole body, is health determined by its four humors, but a dissected, fragmented, and analyzed body. So it's very interesting to see that the first schools of design, the first school of architecture actually, is the Accademia del Disegno in Florence in 1563, founded by Vasari. And where does this academia decides to place itself? Next to the medical school. And what is most interesting too is that all students in the design academy were required to attend dissection in the same way that the medical school, of course, the students needed to attend dissection in the local hospital, Santa Maria Nuova. And this was part of the training. It was supposed to be there for days on end, drawing this body as it decomposed. Even if there were reports that some students were falling ill and some faculty was also falling ill, but nevertheless you have to remain there drawing this body as it decomposed. So as doctors investigated this mysterious interior of the body by cutting it and dissecting it, all of a sudden architects decided also to understand a building you have to cut, you have to slice cuts through the building. And of course, you all are familiar with these sketchbooks of Leonardo da Vinci, for example, where cutaways views of interiors appear sometimes next to anatomical drawings, and he even understood the interiors of the brain and of the womb in architectural terms, as you can see in these drawings, as enclosures that need to be cut through to reveal their secrets. And of course, again, these buildings and bodies that continues, as I saw before, into the 50s with another form of representation instead of the dissection in the case of the Spanish journal, the X-ray. But anyway, as you go through centuries, and to make the story very short, I'm just going to jump quickly to the mid-19th century and just to point out to one example, to Viollet-le-Duc, who already in his Dictionnaire raisonné presented this perspectival cutaway drawing showing medieval buildings. He says, he uses the word as if dissected, and he makes no secret of the fact that he's been extremely influenced by Georges Cuvier, whose lessons of compare anatomy were published, and also Jean-Marc Bourgerie, who also has this treatise of the anatomy of man. And he then goes on to say that we have to treat medieval architecture, and these are the drawings, of course, of Cuvier, and these are drawings of Viollet-le-Duc. We have to treat medieval architecture, Viollet-le-Duc says, as a body that needs to be analyzed, an animate being requiring dissection to allow separate studies of the parts. Well, as medical representations changed, so did architectural representation, and we arrived at the 20th century with the invention of the X-rays that made, of course, a new way of thinking about architecture possible. And all of a sudden, modern buildings started to look like medical images with transparent glass walls revealing the inner secrets of the structure. On the left, you have this beautiful image of a hand, because this idea of having your X-ray after the hand of Bertha Röntgen, that after Röntgen had made the first X-ray of a hand with his wife, with the wedding ring there in the index finger, it became like a fashion for all the aristocracy and the royalty to have their portraits, their intimate portraits in the form of this X-ray. But this is well known, but it's much less well known how architects were fascinated by these X-rays, collected X-rays, and if you think about it, it has enormous influence on their architecture. Here you have, for example, Miss Van der Rohe, whose glass skyscraper of 1922, all of a sudden, you know, he was not able to build it yet, but he has obviously expressing this desire at the same time that the X-ray is able to, you are able with the X-ray to look through the skin of the building to the structure. All of a sudden, architects also have to look through the skin of the building. And in fact, Mies will talk about the skin and bones architecture to see this blurry image of this structure. And of course, he himself was collecting X-rays. He has X-rays in some of his publications, so he's not making any secret of this, but other architects as well were fascinated by the X-ray. In fact, you can argue that the architecture of the early 20th century cannot be understood without grasping its relationship with disease. and in particular with tuberculosis. A year before, the German microbiologist that you can see here, Robert Koch, discovered the tuberculosis bacillus in 1882. A typical standard medical book on tuberculosis gave as causes of the disease, listen to this, lack of exercise, okay, sedentary indoor life, defective ventilation, and deficiency of light. So, of course, despite the fact that the bacillus was there, since it took a very, very long time to find an antibiotic that was effective against the tuberculosis, the only cure was really environmental and therefore architecture. So very much modern architecture start to offer health by providing exactly such a change of the environment. So you here, for example, have the poster of the Weizenhof Siedlung with this cross of the 19th century interior, which has always been read in terms of, we don't like this anymore, it's old fashioned, but it's not that. It's dust, it's tuberculosis, and you can read that very clearly in many of these statements by architects, the obsession with dust, and in fact offering instead, so this 19th century is demonized as unhealthy, not just as out of, and sunlight, ventilation, roof terraces, hygiene, and whiteness are offered as a means to prevent, if not to cure, tuberculosis. So here is Le Corbusier's house in the Weizenhof, and also in East Europe, everywhere you see these images also with terraces, whiteness, and exercise as a way to combat the disease. In fact, one could write an entire book about the impact of tuberculosis on early 20th century architecture, beginning perhaps with the active collaborations, and this is very important, and I think it's something that we should return to, because in this moment still there's very active collaboration between architects and doctors in the design of tuberculosis sanatoriums such as Alvar Aalto and Aino Aalto in Paimio in Finland of 1929, with these very dramatic terraces up in the sky. The Paimio sanatorium even has kind of a resemblance in these canonic photographs to an X-ray to the ribs in an X-ray of the chest. The clean line bedrooms that are completely devoid of ornament were designed also precisely to minimize surfaces where dust could accumulate. So you can see these very simple lines, and also even the intersection of the floor and the wall is exactly is curved, so that dust could not accumulate under the window. The rooms were perfectly equipped also with all the furniture and sanitary equipment that were designed by the Aaltos, including chairs whose back was angled so to facilitate breathing and expectoration, they say. Sinks designed to reduce splashing, spittoons designed to minimize sound, door handles carefully designed not to catch the sleeves of the doctors' white coats. But of course, the main kind of equipment of the sanatorium is this top floor terrace, 7 stories above the forest, where patients were wheeled out for regular doses of fresh air and sun in these lounge chairs, carefully designed by Aino Aalto. In fact, you have even this fantastic photograph of Aino Aalto herself in the chair that she had designed in Paimio, lying in the terrace. I mean, not exactly the typical heroic image of the modern architect standing in front of their building, but precisely the architect also as a patient on the horizontal. In any case, the discovery and success of streptomycin in 1943, it took still a long time to make it available in hospitals and in clinics, revealed that there was little scientific basis for the air and sun therapy, and sometimes the therapy even precipitated the end at Paimio quite literally, because apparently the terrace at some point had to be closed off, as I discovered when I visited the building some 20 years ago, because the nurses couldn't keep up with the number of patients that will kind of throw themselves front the terrace every time they turn their backs on them. Tuberculosis, you can argue that made modern architecture modern, and this is a very important point because it's not that modern architects made modern buildings and modern sanatoriums, rather the sanatorium modernized architects. And I give you an example because actually Aalto was a very neoclassic architect, a perfectly good but very neoclassic architect. Before his so-called conversion, in his own words, to functionalism, in 1927, by his own account, when he entered the competition for a tuberculosis sanatorium in Kinkoma in Finland, which he didn't win. This unrealized project in many ways, as you can see, of horizontal lines and wide terraces for the cure, in many ways anticipates Paimio. For Aalto, in any case, the sanatorium was not architecture in the service of medicine, but integral to medicine itself, kind of an apparatus device as a means of treatment. He writes, the main purpose of the building is to function as a medical instrument. So the building is now a medical instrument. The room design is determined by the depleted strength of the patient reclining in his bed. And you have these drawings of the patient reclining in the bed. It's also very important to understand that Aalto himself had been sick at the time of the commission of the building, and claimed that having to lie in bed for a very long time he had been crucial to his understanding of the problem. Architecture, he says, is always conceived for the vertical person, and he has these beautiful drawings with the vertical person. But here you have a client that is constantly permanently in the horizontal, so the whole design of the room, in other words, has to change. You cannot keep the light fixtures on the ceiling, irritating the eyes of the occupant lying on the bed, and the view through the window also has to be calculated to the forest outside, so that you can see these very low parapets, for example, in the terrace, that allow the and very thin rail to allowing the horizontal eye of the patient to travel far away into the forest. And even he talks about the colors of the room and the building had to be thought in those terms too. And he talks about white, dark hues of blue for the ceiling and the walls in lighter shades. And he talks about bright canary yellow in the reception booth by the entrance and in the linoleum of the lobby, in the staircases and the corridors to evoke, he says, sunny optimism, even in cold, cloudy days. An extended period of confinement, he says, can be extremely depressing for a bedridden patient. So he goes on to have psychological factors are also very important in architecture. A tuberculosis sanatorium, he says, should be, to all intents and purposes, a house with open windows. Okay, that seems like normal. We want to make the hospital kind of welcoming, and you have to feel at home. You make a hospital like a big house. Okay, but the interesting thing for me is when he reverses the idea, and all of a sudden he says that if the hospital has to be thought as a new kind of house, in reverse, the generic house should be like a sanatorium. And I was like, oh, this is really incredible. And he goes on to say, I was able to discover that the special physical and psychological reactions by patients provide good pointers for ordinary housing. To examine how human beings react to forms and constructions is useful to use for experimentation, especially sensitive people such as patients in a sanatorium. So it's fascinating that the bodily and psychological sensitivity of this sick person is used here to recalibrate architecture. Even the specialized furniture became ordinary pieces. You have here this famous cantilever Paimio chair, for example, which was designed, as he said before, to open the chest of the patient, allowing them to breathe easier. But soon enough, this chair became everybody's chair. And likewise for the rest of the furniture designed for Paimio. He says the sanatorium, or they say the sanatorium needed furniture which should be light, flexible, easy to clean, and so on. And after extensive experimentation in wood, the flexible system was discovered to produce furniture which was more suitable, he says, for the long and painful life in a sanatorium. Okay, so a workshop is established next to Paimio, and they produced this furniture for the sanatorium. But in 2 years, Artec appears, and the Finnish company Artec, and this furniture that was initially for the sick person becomes, of course, everybody's furniture. And even in the publicity of this company, in the early years of the publicity of this company, they described their ambition to support and nourish human beings' physical and psychological well-being. So this is not just any chair. This is a chair that protects you in more than one way. In any case, for the Aaltos, the reference points, and I think this is very important as well, was the seriously ill. Aalto claimed that the architect has always to design for the person in the weakest position. So do you think about that? Because this has enormous implications for how we think today about architecture and disabilities, right? Because in many ways, this is like the road not taken. If we design, as he is proposing in this moment, the architect has to design for the person in the weakest position, then everybody else will take care, right? Will be fine. In fact, we are all in the weakest position at a certain point in our life, whether it's because we are too young or too old, or we broke our leg, or we are sick, or whatever. So in many ways, this made me go back to modern architecture and see all these moments that there were already these possibilities that were not taken up, of thinking about designing differently. Well, it's a little bit of an aside, but I think it's an important aside in light of how important these questions have become in our times. In any case, the tuberculosis patient became the model for modern architecture. In other words, sickness was no longer seen as the exception, but as the norm. And varying degrees of sickness, of course, define the human condition. The modern subject suffers from many ailments, physical and psychological, and architecture provides a protective cocoon, not just against the weather and other outside threats as we normally think about, but in modernity, very clearly and very notably against internal threats, against psychological and bodily ailments, very much like what is happening in our times, and very much like what I think architects should be thinking about now. Symptomatically, Aalto compared his experiments in Paimio and their application to everyday use to the exaggerated forms of analysis that scientists use in order to obtain clear and more visible results, such as stained bacteria for microscopic examination. So this was really interesting because he saw medical design as a form of medical research, with the sanatorium acting as a kind of research lab for architecture, a way of testing architecture, looking at what has normally been hidden and exposing the invisible forces. And of course, this brings me to the question of who are the invisible clients of modern architecture. Because in fact, if you think about it a little bit, Sigmund Freud, the X-ray, bacteriology, and the germ theory of the disease all emerged in the very same short period of time, and they are all about the same. They are all about looking inside, acknowledging the invisible, the unconscious, the skeleton, the macro element of bacteria, the bacillus of tuberculosis. Likewise, architecture turns itself inside out. The threat is no longer outside, but inside, in this invisible. The micro scale of the bacteria becomes the base, of course, for furniture, for rooms, for houses, for cities. This micro and the macro, you could say, the bacterium and the city. Cities were suddenly seen as completely teeming with unseen occupants that in a sense became the new clients of modern architecture and urbanism, this bacteria. Right? And the architect doctor becomes a bacteriology. Architecture itself becomes bacterial. As Le Corbusier put it in a passage in a book that is very well known, Precisions, we need a diagnosis and a line of conduct. In 1922, I tried to delve into an analysis. I did some laboratory work, isolating my microbe. I watched it develop, the biology of my microbe appear in indisputable clarity. 32 acquired a diagnosis. Then by effort of synthesis, I drew up the fundamental principles of modern city planning. So here you have it, from the city, from the microbe to the city, clearly explained. Microbes were both the literal and metaphorical basis of a new architecture and urbanism. And modern architecture paradoxically has to represent this new invisible order with bright, transparent images seen as clean and clear and healthy in a kind of visual hygiene. And the history of modern architecture, of course, is full of sanatoriums. You can think about Joseph Hoffmann, the Purkersdorf outside Vienna of 1903, so at the very beginning of the 20th century. You can think about Otto Wagner, Steinhoff. You can think about all these sanatoriums in Davos, like the Queen Alexandra, for example, by the architects Otto Fletcher and Mascafeli, and the engineer Robert Maillard. There's always great architects with great engineers in this building. You can think about Ducker and Bernard Vigier, Sonnenstrahl in Hilversum, Richard Docker Sanatorium in Weiblinger, and so many other sanatoriums, never-ending number of sanatoriums. Many modern architects did a sanatorium at some point, and often it defines them. Right? The sanatorium was the testing ground of new materials and techniques of construction, and always, very often at least, involve very experimental collaborations between architects, engineers, and doctors, as you will see. So cutting-edge architects with cutting-edge engineers and cutting-edge doctors. Here is Hilversum, and it's typical of this situation because the sanatoriums typically were disconnected from cities, floating in a way, like ships on mountain tops or in forests, by lakes or by the coast, with rows upon rows of these sand terraces that are treated like little beaches, sometimes linked to artificial beaches on the inside of the building, like these little kids in France, or to real beaches outside, like this one somewhere in Odessa, with these nurses supervising these bodies lying on the beach. It is this sense of floating outside is normal human habitat, and angling yourself or the building itself to the sun to heal fragile bodies challenge the definition of architecture. In many ways, it is as if architecture itself was taking the cure. The whole building seems to be adjusting itself like a solar device, sometimes stacking itself to a very kind of steep angle, like with Martha Breuer and Gustav Wassenflug 1930 project for a 1,000-bed sanatorium, or even more extreme, like the one on the right of Nicola Bisontin in 1934 in the Italian Alps. And this attitude is taken to the extreme in my favorite project, which is this collaboration between a radiologist, Jan Seidman, and the architect André Fardet, to make this 25-meter-long revolving sanatorium, 16 meters above the ground, that always faced the sun for the tuberculosis patient. In fact, they made a prototype. It became very successful, and they did it in several places, not just in France, but even in India. This is in Jamnagar, in India. And it had very sophisticated retractable glass panels and specialized focusing instruments to increase the exposure of the sun. And even the beds, as you can see here, are suspended in metal frames that enable them to be rotated up to a very steep angle to be aligned with the instrument. So here you have the Purkersdorf again. Because the sanatorium had, from the beginning, been a laboratory for incubating new attitudes towards form. Take this Joseph Hoffmann Purkersdorf with these purified white surfaces and radically sharp lines and cubic furniture. And very interesting, Hennebicke construction in reinforced concrete and iron and use of glass and electricity, all considered actually part of the hygienic program. Not only was electricity considered more hygienic, but it was also used in all kinds of experimental therapies, including these electrical massage machines, electric baths, and chairs for strengthening the nerves. At the time the Purkersdorf was built, this architectural critic, Ludwig Hevesi, described it as the naked Hoffman building, whose walls were lined with white porcelain tiles, a white painted, white tile washable. We clean everything, right? He basically was so enthusiastic that he checked himself into the sanatorium to test personally all these therapeutic devices in the so-called mechanotherapy room, like a torture room, and he's full of artificial devices, and electric massage machines, everything is electric, he says. Electricity itself was understood as a medical instrument. It's very interesting to see how this hospital was constructed as an addition to an earlier sanatorium that had been completed by this neuropsychiatrist, Krafft-Ebing, who died before the Purkersdorf was completed, but he was very influential in his theories. And Krafft-Ebing had argued that the modern metropolis was damaging the nerves of the inhabitants, and that air, light, nature, and simplicity were the most forms of therapy. And he wrote these books on healthy and sick nerves and psychopathia sexualis. It's also very interesting because he coined the term masochism, and after the author Leopold von Sacher, masoch, and also popularized the term sadismo. So once again, health was understood in psychosexual and architectural terms. It's super fascinating to see who was frequenting the Purkersdorf, because it was a really notable circle of patients. You have here Gustav Mahler, Arnold Schoenberg, Hugo von Hohenstahl, Solomon Moser, who had designed the furniture, and even the architect of the building, Joseph Hoffmann, checked himself in and out of the sanatorium regularly. He had suffered from and was treated apparently for a nervous disorder even prior to the commission of the Purkersdorf, and was sympathetic to Krafft-Ebing's ideas. According to Seckler, this was what why Hoffmann was inclined to accept the commission. What is fascinating too is that the Purkersdorf accepted patients with a wide variety of medical conditions, and this was actually quite typical of the sanatorium, including nervous disorders of every kind, neurasthenia, eating disorders, substance abuse, and hysteria. So the sanatorium had become a new kind of social space for the Viennese upper class and the intelligentsia that check himself in, and sometimes they have a nervous disorder, and sometimes they have tuberculosis, and maybe the one with the nervous disorder came out of there with tuberculosis, and everybody seemed still kind of baffled about that, like they couldn't quite believe that this was contagious. Here's Solomon Moser. I don't know exactly what the designer of the furniture. I'm not so sure what he was suffering from, but here you have him in a picture of this period. And there is Bertha Zucker-Kandel, who was actually a journalist and critic for the Vienna Allgemeine Zeitung, and characterized the Purkersdorf precisely as a cross between a modern hotel and a modern therapeutic center. On the other hand, Karl Kraus, much more caustic, described it as a healing swindle institution. They say they will heal you, but in fact they don't have any idea of what you have. Right? So there were several different reactions to this kind of institutions. In any case, critics hail the building as one of clarity and truth. The success of the institution owed enormously to the modernity of the architecture. Modern was actually becoming a new and sophisticated taste among the bourgeoisie and the intelligentsia, who were supposed to dine around a single white table at the Purkersdorf in a kind of talking cure, and sleep in what they considered at that time Spartan white rooms, and subject themselves to these regimes of treatment, electric treatments in white spaces. So it's interesting to understand the association of cubic white forms with mental and physical health was so strong for architecture to actually act as a very effective placebo. The idea had made itself into literature. There is this short novel of Thomas Mann, Tristan, written in 1903, precisely the same year as the construction of the Purkersdorf, and it's set in an imaginary sanatorium, the Einfried, a long white rectilinear building, warmly recommended, he says, for lung patients, but also for patients of all sorts, sufferers of gastric disorder, people with defective hearts, paralytics, rheumatics, nervous sufferers of all grumblings. And when one of the patients, Hart Clotterjan's wife, asked another, "What are you in the Einfried really? What cure are you taking, Herr Espinel?" So Mr. Espinel, he answers, "Cure? Oh, and I myself electrify a bit, nothing worth mentioning. I will tell you the real reason why I'm here, madam. It is a feeling for style. Obviously, people feel one way among furniture that is soft and comfortable and voluptuous, and quite another among the straight lines of these tables, chairs, and draperies. This brightness and hardness, this cold, austere simplicity and reserve for strength, madam, it has upon me the ultimate effect of an inward purification and rebirth. Beyond a doubt, is morally elevating, right? So here you have exactly what is happening. Style, as in the Purkersdorf, is the true cure of what ails Herr Espinel, who, by the way, wears in this novel a white jacket and a white hat in this all white building, in this spotless white region, all covered in snow with the white enamel armchairs and white folding doors and white painted gallery inhabited by the white faces and white hands of the patients with their white veil, desire by passion driven. So if you read this novel, you will see that whiteness is the most insistent feature of the building, the landscape, and the patient in this Einfried sanatorium. And of course, this is, of course, not an accident. Sado-Masochism. Okay, I don't know how we're doing with time, but let's go very quickly here. This is Kraft. Evin's idea seems to have an effect in architects too. You have Camillo Sitek, who criticized the design of the modern city also, not because he doesn't like it probably either, but he also says that it's causing agoraphobia and all kinds of nervous conditions. And in his book, City Planning According to Artistic Principles, he advocated for these intimate urban spaces that as in a medieval city protect the inhabitant. Adolf Loos, likewise, also, by the way, a student of masochism, if you are interested in the topic. There are multiple references in his writing, nobody has taken it, as far as I know, argues and this, that the man with the modern nerves cannot tolerate ornament. So it's not that he doesn't like it, the man with the modern nerves cannot tolerate it. This is important. He gave these 4 lectures in German at the Sorbonne in Paris in 1926, and the whole series is entitled "The Man with the Modern Nerves," as you can see here. The subject of the nerves that preoccupy Loos practically all his life and permeates all his writings from the turn of the century. There are multiple references to the nerves. For Loos, the rejection of ornament is not an aesthetic choice, as many times is presented, but it's really a neurological reaction if you look closely at what he says. The elimination of ornament for him is almost a narcotic choice. He argues that we moderns no longer have the nerves that are necessary to eat, dress, and decorate as in previous centuries. In Ornament and Crime, which I'm sure you have read because it's a very famous text, but everybody seems to miss that passage, perhaps it's not in the English translation. He speaks of his horror in front of these decorate animals in culinary displays, particularly if he thinks he has to eat one of these stuffed animal corpses. I only eat roast beef, he says, of course, roast beef being the abstraction of meat. And he feels the same nausea, he says, in the face of any excessive ornament, whether in food or in architecture. We lack the steady nerves to drink from an elephant ivory tusk on which an Amazon bottle has been engraved, he writes. And here you have Adolf Loos in this beautiful painting by Kokoschka, and you can see clearly that he is a very nervous man. Look at his hands. But the obsession with the nerves is not just a Viennese hang-up, let's say. In his glass architecture, Paul Serber wrote sanatoria also will want glass buildings. The influence let me see if I put the quote. Sanatorium also will want glass buildings. The influence of a splendid glass architecture on the nerves is indisputable. Well, I never thought about that, but maybe that's what he thinks. So Serber was also obsessed with hygiene and with the elimination of the dust and the pollen and and in insects. And he has this telegram novel called The Mid-Ocean High Fever Sanatorium, which was published in Der Stern in 1912, where he talks about floating islands with breeze-colored glass pavilions. Everyone in America, he says, no, not sure why in America, is plagued by hay fever. So during the flowering season, we will all live in the middle of the ocean, where Oceanic Sanatorium Society for High Fevers has found just the right thing. Floating islands that will always live hundreds of miles away from dry land and natural inlands. Serber saw modern technology actually as both the cause and the cure of illnesses. His rise of nerve doctors that are prescribing the calming effect of colored light in sanatorium. You saw all these drawings that he has. And already in 901, he speculated about air sanatorium, flying in the sky to deal with nervous disorders of the metropolis. It's very important because you realize how much, for more than a century, architects have been obsessed with nervous disorders and nervous mental illnesses, but we have decided to neglect these. But of course, for Serber, air technology, which is at the center of his utopian novels, is both a cure and a cause. In a pre-war manifesto for pacifismo that he wrote in 1914, he predicted that air warfare will produce general insanity. He says, just thinking about all these military techniques can have a deleterious effect on one's nerves, again the nerves. Right? For him, at least, this was prophetic. He suffered a nervous breakdown over the carnage of World War I and apparently starved himself to death in 1915, seemingly in protest. But since he had not really taken part in the war, it was as if just thinking about it had indeed provoked his death. And with this, I move to the architecture cure and to Davos in Switzerland, which was actually the epicenter of this phenomenon of the modern cure. There were more than 26 sanatoriums already in 910, among them the Schwalz, built between 1899 and 1900, and the only sanatorium that is identified by name in the famous novel of Thomas Mann, The Magic Mountain, which is you read now, you'll see how much architecture is playing a role there. And again, it's a characteristic example of a collaboration between a doctor, two young architects from Zurich, and the engineer Robert Maillard, who had been working for Francois Genevieve. So the first building in Switzerland to be constructed in concrete and steel happens to be precisely this building, a sanatorium. And so again, you have this, that the most advanced medical treatment coincides with the most advanced technology in architecture and engineering. And this kind of collaboration, I think, is one of the things we have lost. The architecture of the Schwalb is brutally modern in its horizontality, even if it doesn't look to you that brutal. It is abstract and brutal in this moment with 100 meters long facade, and it is endless corridors. The building is like an ocean liner with these terraces for the therapy, with patients reclining in these especially designed chairs for the cure. Listen to this, taking between 7 a.m. and 10 p.m. In winter and in summer, you have this group of patients lying on chairs packed closely together in the terrace, covered in this thick blanket of snow, right? So they have been there the entire, look at this picture, because it's funny, they have so many attendants and nevertheless they all seem to be quite pissed off, right? And you go out to this one and they are completely, they have been abandoned to the broom as the caretaker, who is the broom as the caretaker, and covered in this blanket of snow, and they seem totally happy. Thomas Mann, always sensitive to the architectural detail, describes this therapeutic chaise longue with great care in his novels, evoking a philosophy of life in the edge and in the horizontal. This therapy of the horizontal is also central to the Bald Sanatorium, also in Davos, where Katia Mann was Thomas' wife, Mann stayed, and it inspired him to write The Magic Mountain. And Mann novels about his social life in this very modern building where everything was wrapped in white, even this patient who was wrapping in white about to receive hydrotherapy. Katia Mann was in fact one of the very first patients in this brand new sanatorium. She fell ill in 1912 after the birth of her fourth child. Her mother was convinced that Katia was not suffering from tuberculosis, but from exhaustion, having had 4 children and 2 miscarriages in less than 5 years, managing a large household and even typing Mann's manuscripts. It's also kind of painful to read that, to understand that Katia had been studying mathematics and experimental physics with Wilhelm Röntgen, the discoverer of X-rays, of course, no less. But her mother had encouraged her to abandon her studies to marry Thomas Mann at the age of 21. Anyway, whatever her ailments, she stayed in and out of sanatoriums until 1914, where she went back home because of the war, I suppose, and bang, had 2 more children, as you can see in this picture. Tuberculosis was, of course, always confounded with nervous disorders of every kind, as we saw, and the inevitable melancholy meant that the standard cure was also psychological. Sanatoriums in many ways offer not just an escape from the city, but also an escape from normal domestic life with the comfort of a controlled regime and a distracting daily rhythm or in the company of new friends. These hyper-designed spaces of the clinic even presented a new form of domestic elegance. Katia Mann actually said the experience had strengthened her so that she could stand it all. And of course, there was a lot to stand: World War II, exile to the United States, the suicide of her favorite son, her oldest son, Klaus, and later of her son, Michael. How does anybody survive all of this? I don't know. The modern ocean liner environment for the rich and fabulous somehow became democratized at a certain point, with sanatoriums such as Zonnestraal in Hilversum in the Netherlands, 20 miles outside Amsterdam. It was designed by, as I said before, as Ducker and Visuet for the General Diamond Workers Union of the Netherlands. And again, in this reinforced concrete building, the medical properties of the architecture are again taken to the stream. Zonnestraal was really a health machine, a factory for the production of healthy bodies, with this slogan, allow light, air, and sun, very much like the slogan of modern architect. And you can see these patients that are wheeled out of their independent rooms and into the turrets, which, as you can see, is no longer a very social space as in earlier sanatoriums. There is less interaction among the patients, who seem, in period photographs at least, to keep their heads inside the room and inside their books. The real interaction seems to be with the sun and with machines like these complex instruments as these latest respiratory analysis devices. I thought at first the individual rooms was an advance in a working class sanatorium, but then I reread again Thomas Bernhard, the famous writer from Vienna, who spent also many years in and out of sanatorium as tuberculosis patient. There's a lot of architecture too in Thomas Bernhard. I totally recommend it. Wittgenstein, nephew, and all of them, right? All his writings are infiltrated by this tuberculosis, and there's a lot of architecture there. But reading again, I became aware that the most terrifying thing in a sanatorium was when you were moved into an individual room. That could only mean one thing, right? You know, you were about to go. Death was itself hidden. Sanatoriums in Davos and in other places did not accept very ill patients. Death was a spot in their reputation, and they exaggerated their rate of cure. And more interesting, there were subterranean tunnels, which were discovered recently in the refurbishing of some of these sanatoriums as luxury hotels in Switzerland, that there were these subterranean tunnels that carried the dead away and out of view. And at the Schwalz that you can see here, which is 300 meters above the town of Davos, the bodies of the dead were sent down the mountain on toboggans in winter, as Thomas Mann describes in The Magic Mountain. It's also interesting that this is an idea that's also in literature. So I'm already going back to Tristan of Thomas Mann, where he writes that sometimes a death takes place among the most severe cases. And when this happens, no one knows. Not even the person sleeping next door. In the silence of the night, the waxen guest is put away, and life at the Einfried goes tranquilly on with its massage, its electric treatments, its doses, its bath, with its exercise, its steaming and inhaling in rooms especially equipped with all the triumphs of modern therapeutic. Right? So again, you know, this is a constant motif in novels, and you can see that in architecture it has these mechanisms of making death disappear. Death, of course, in modernity is always hidden. Visual hygiene also means designing that what you don't want to see, or what you don't see, you don't want to see. This Otto Wagner's famous plan for the Großstadt in 9/11, where high-speed trains, you may want to ask in a minute what is the rush, were to remove the dead, transporting corpses in their coffins from specially designed mortuary stations to the cemeteries in the outskirts of the city. He says, Wagner, every large city should soon be in a position to limit the transportation of corpses to the railroad, and it seems therefore proper to provide each neighborhood with a mortuary station for this purpose. Okay, but more significant, in fact, that the architecture of the sanatorium as medical instrument is the impact of medical thought on all of modern architecture, as I was saying before. The constant preoccupation with ventilation, with sunlight, with hygiene and white walls that turn all buildings into medical instruments. As Ulrich, which is the personage or the figure of Robert Musil, The Man Without Qualities, a novel about 1913 Vienna, written in 1930, he writes, modern man is born in a hospital and dies in a hospital. Hence, he should also live in a place like a hospital. Yeah? So here you go with these images, for example, of Otto Wagner, that very much argues that the modern house should be like a hospital, and claim that there should not be difference between a house and a hospital. There should be these clean white surfaces that replace the upholstered interiors of the 19th century, where dust accumulates and illness is latent. Okay, I'm going to cut through all of these, the open air school, etc. And perhaps to finish, I will introduce you to the Tugendhat house, which you all know in a few minutes, which in under a very different light, because not only modern architects emphasize health and exercise in opposition to the dangers of the disease, but their architecture was also understood that way. The buildings became unconsciously identified with the need to produce a healthy body. So here you have Mies van der Rohe Tugendhat house, which is not just any house, but the kind of uber house of modernity, in the cover of the modern architecture exhibition in MoMA in 1930. And the Tugendhats, which were both Jews, escaped to Switzerland in the eve of the German occupation of Czechoslovakia. And when the house came into the hands of the communist bureaucrats who had no idea what this house meant, they immediately decided that the thing was to turn it into a hospital. In fact, it was turned into a center for children with disabilities by these communist bureaucrats who had no idea that the house had been photographed in its early years precisely in that space. In fact, it was first turned into a physical education institute, and you have these fantastic images of children, like in a Busby Berkeley movie, exercising. This is the terrace of the Tugendhat. This is the terrace of the Tugendhat. And what I was saying is that these guys, they have no idea probably that the house had already been photographed precisely in the same spirit, with early photographs of the Tugendhat kids playing in the sun in the terrace, and candidly echo with the image of children exercising in the living room and on the terrace. The Tugendhats themselves understood the house as a machine for health. when an architectural critic had polemically asked the question, is the Tugendhat house habitable? In the pages of the journal Die Form, both Fritz Tugendhat and Grete symptomatically invoke Davos. Fritz writes, after almost a year living in the house, I can assure you without hesitation that technically possess everything a modern person might wish for. On clear and frosty days, one can lower his window, sit in the sun, and enjoy the view of a snow-covered landscape like in Davos. Like in Davos. So in winter, of course, the family will sit in this living room with the big glass that can, of course, be lowered into the ground until make it completely disappear, taking the sun and the fresh air like in Davos, like in a sanatorium. And you have, of course, these photographs of the family by amateur photographer and filmmaker Fritz Tugendhat, with the children playing around kind of naked in the outdoor spaces, evoking very much the ideas of the Levens reform movement. Grete himself was completely obsessed with the children falling ill, and they had a kind of quarantine room for the children. Fritz Tugendhat himself was not in good health at the time of the commission, and Mies says he was a very careful man and he was sick. He did not believe in one doctor, but he had three. What Mies doesn't seem to realize is that this was not that unusual. Uncertainty in the early 20th century about the new scientific medicine made it commonplace among the bourgeoisie to consult different kinds of doctors and alternative practitioners and to follow multiple kinds of advice. And in a sense, the architect was added as yet another medical consultant. So here you have the medical consultant, Mies van der Rohe on the side, the smoking, not exactly a very healthy thing to do, actually consulting here with Grete Tugendhat. We are probably too late, but just want to say that for me, returning to the pandemic of today, that perhaps the bed is actually has been the face of this pandemic. First, it was the urgent call for more hospital beds in the early days, then beds overflowing every hospital, filling every space in the hospital corridors, former waiting rooms, nobody's waiting anymore, of course. Any room of any size became a room for beds. Then these enormous images of cavernous spaces, whereas in Madrid or Serbia, full of empty beds in this grid, is with an oxygen tank and a domestic lamp waiting, like any bed with a ventilator became an ICU bed, so the bed becomes the room, the architecture. You see even these images of Central Park and more beds, so the Javits Center turn into, these aerial views remind me of Jacques Tati and the office buildings, and which probably we are returning to this, and this situation. But perhaps more interesting, the beds are not just in the media, but there are also media platforms. Think about all these Zooming, broadcasting, FaceTimings that are happening from beds. All this whose last contact was on the phone, and a phone sometimes held by a nurse. Think of all of those connecting to friends and colleagues and relatives from their beds, and also those working from bed. The bed is not a secret anymore. This architecture of the pervasive bed is, of course, not just a side effect of the pandemic, but the pandemic has exposed it, and this is what I wanted to leave you with, these beds that we have seen in the media, that we have seen in the streets in New York, that we have seen in all these Zoom meetings, just to throw a ball to in which way we can start thinking about the architecture of this pandemic. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating. Absolutely amazing. Would you be okay taking some questions?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
There is a first question on the bottom. You see question and answer. There's a question from Marina Rodriguez das Neves.
Mm-hmm.
Can you see it, or? Yeah.
Yes, my name is Marina. You want me to read it? I am from Argentina. I have some questions. The first is, do you think that a pandemic, like something that exposes something more than a human condition, a micro scale, will contribute to the disembodiment of a concrete machine far from a formal conception of architecture? I mean, from a dead body to a relational and abstract machine in its micro scale, in a diagrammatic field of forces and energy that architecture really is. Another question is, what do you think? Is the architecture of the sanatorium is about organs without a body, or a body without organs? Oh my God, so many questions in one. Thank you so much, Marina, and thank you for being from, speaking from, or watching this from Argentina. About the question of exposure and how I think it's a very interesting question, because pandemics always expose what is already there. Not this one, of course, this one in very patent ways exposes the realities that we were already living through. But if you look at it historically, it is always the case, and it's also the case that there is also this scapegoating immediately, trying to get to blame it on someone, whether it's another country or another or a group inside your own thing. So whether it's Jewish population in the time of the plagues in Italy, for example, at times this has been blamed on certain groups, or whether it's on the immigrants coming from other countries to work in the vendimia, for example, in France or in Spain. Right now, it's always blaming the other, exposing clearly also all the inequities, those privileged like us that can be at home, zooming and watching lectures or teaching, and those who are in the front lines of the pandemic. And this is and all these inequities to all these people without healthcare, at least in this country. I mean, maybe in the Netherlands is different, obviously, Winka, and also in Northern European countries. But in this one, I mean, it's become really unbelievable. So this is, I think, what I meant when they said that the pandemic makes visible what previously was somehow the invisible city.
Yeah, and now it's the empty city.
Yeah, empty in some ways, and not so much empty. It's an interiorized condition, right? I mean, we are. It's fascinating in relation to tuberculosis, if you think about it, because tuberculosis was described by doctors and nurses as a house problem. So the problem was in the house, and it was all about getting out, having a terrace. The terrace is an invention in many ways that has to do with this problem of this house that needs to open to the outside, and that the body itself needs to be in this intermediate position, taking the air and the sun. And in this pandemic, we are actually asked to return home. So the house is the safe space, because much more like in pandemics of earlier times, the danger is in the street, the danger is in public transportation, the danger is in public space, which can lead also to very conservative arguments about how we are all going to go back and live in the suburbs or something like this, or whether we are going to abandon the cities. I will never abandon New York, no matter what. But they will not catch me dead in the suburbs, that's for sure. But this is leading to this kind of questions. Yeah.
Do you know the question about the body without organs and the organs without a body? That's a really hard one.
I don't know. I mean, this is always, this question has been around for a long time with Deleuze, and I don't know. I really don't know what to say about those things. I suppose that I don't think about it in those terms. I mean, I'm more intrigued by the question of the micro and the macro, as I express in the lecture to this idea that the real clients of modern architecture turn out to be these minute organisms, and that in many ways you can understand modern architecture as being bacteriological, reacting to this and catering to this. And now, of course, these have created its own problems, and we may want to think about that too, because of course this obsession with eliminating bacteria, which is, by the way, the oldest form of life in the planet, 3 billion years old or whatever, we are like a recent arrival and will be soon gone and nobody will miss us, and none of these microbes. We are in fact ourselves bags of bacteria.
Yeah.
And as has been clearly demonstrated in scientific circles for a long time, all this research on the microbiome, etc., is exactly, we have created a problem actually with our obsession with eliminating bacteria and the age of allergies and all these other problems that we have created, like sick syndrome building, etc., etc. So we have to be, in fact, more welcoming of this bacteria now. But unlike the early period of modern architecture, when architects were actively collaborating with doctors and scientists, we have dropped the ball, and I don't know why we have dropped the ball. This is my call here for us to re-engage, because there is fascinating research going on right now on the microbiome, and we should engage in what does constitute a healthy building in our time.
Yeah, no, it's a very good point, and it's overdue. Zaid Al-Gapta is another question.
Do I see it at the modern? Okay, why don't I see? Modern architecture reacted to the visual representation of medical world in case of current pandemic with more advanced than we expect architecture you think will be affected. Yeah, this I didn't go too much into this, but it's correct that that modern the X-ray, which was the dominant, of course, diagnosis tool for tuberculosis, became an obsession for architects and, of course, for artists and others too, and also for the general public that was fascinated by this question. And in more contemporary times, I have given thought to the obsession that the generation of the 90s with the first computer-assisted design had with the CAT scan of the brain. All of a sudden, if architects of the early 20th century had their books full of X-rays, all of a sudden, architects of that generation had their books putting CAT scans of the brain and of the body next to their projects, and that makes you think about the fact that as architects we have always been fascinated with the latest technologies of viewing the body. COVID doesn't manifest itself in those terms. Of course, there have been some images of the lungs and how it affects this virus affects the functioning of the lungs, but it's not a new technology, right? So we are talking more about micro again, right? I don't know.
It's interesting. It also seems to attack the nerves, no? Talking about what I thought was fascinating when you talked about how the early people all thought it was a nerve affliction. No?
Yeah.
It was basically doing something to your nerves. And actually, funny enough, this virus does also do something to your nerves.
Yes, and actually it does something to the nerves of all of us, because
also.
We may say it's of course a privileged position to have a house that you can retreat to, but it hasn't been easy in the slightest. I mean, and I think many people have suffered from all kinds of problems. Perhaps people that had other problems before were exacerbated by people that didn't have them before, had developed all kinds of difficulties. And this is also something that we may want to think about. What does it mean return to or to retreat to the interior to such an extent. And
yeah. It's also really interesting socially and urbanistically is, for example, that the mayors have allowed homeless people to occupy hotels.
Well,
And, you know, that is actually really interesting because that's kind of an inside out situation, right? Where typically homeless people are outside. And this is a strange period because homeless people are not just homeless people as we know them. These are people who've lost their job and are basically homeless because they lost their home.
Yes, and more are going to lose it. I mean, if we keep that way and we don't have, you know, any so far, you know, I mean, it's been horrifying. I mean, some places I agree with you, but also think about what is happening with this thing of the bed, about how we are all now working from home and from, in many ways, from our beds. Many people, that's the only private space they have in the entire house. They may be sharing an apartment with friends or with their family, and the only place they have is the people have been working in bed for a long time already. I mean, this is a trend, again, that's made visible by this pandemic, but it was already there, this desire to work remotely, this desire to work from bed. And then that calls to question to the fact that we are living in actually 19th century industrial cities with the separation of the place of work and the place of living. And that we are, in a way, returning to pre-industrial times in which people are working on the same place that they live. And then you think, well, then the cities that we are living with, the city of business here and the place for residents there, well, maybe that doesn't work anymore.
Exactly.
Office buildings are empty, or mostly empty, and they were empty before this pandemic, and this only has exacerbated because once we have learned so much about how to work
and no one can commute, right? This is the next problem in mass transport.
Right, but once we can, will we ever go back to do the same things? I mean, you know, as you say, faculty meetings, well, maybe it's better this way. Some of those things may be better. And in many offices are already saying, no, it works better. You know, some people. Yeah. So if that is the case, then what are we doing with these office buildings? And you know, we have a huge problem of homeless population. I was getting back to your point. You know, there are all these campuses of, you know, by star architects in recent years, and you know, in California or wherever, and you know, and now they are talking about keeping these people working at home. Okay, what are you going to do with this? Maybe you could open it up to them. Other possibilities like office buildings for homeless housing.
Yeah, no, exactly.
There's a question here from.
There's one more. Can you? Okay, is it okay? Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Okay, see, St. Patrick from Barcelona, you mentioned about how cities are formed by various layers, which are usually created by the medical event, as opposed to the sanatorium you reference, which were strategically away from the city, where cities today are rapidly growing and expanding out. When did you insight on how the dense city be redesigned, rethought, or have readapted to the situation that lie ahead of us? Yes, yeah. I mean with that, you know, if you think about all the infrastructure that makes our cities livable to the, let's say, shortage, or, you know, all the infrastructure, you know, this is a response to epidemics, if you think about it, you know, cholera in London, and, you know, made it necessary, all this great infrastructure work to bring clean water to the city, to eliminate the waste in safe ways, etc., etc. This was the problem before. So, and we tend to kind of, okay, you know, we don't remember that so much, right? We just move on, right? But if you think about this, then if you just focus on what pandemic has brought to particular cities or then you see these layers and layers that form the city. What will this pandemic produce in the city? We don't know, because we don't know how long this will go on. I'll give you one example. The tuberculosis, which was a very, very long problem, well, is Neolithic. Since the Neolithic, but it became really terrible with industrialization, of course, right? This was a major problem in big cities, right? This had an effect on architecture, probably because the cure involved architecture. The flu of 1918, which had so many millions of people killed all over the map, well, it has no effect on architecture. I have looked at it. There hasn't been any architect, and they lived through it. All these architects, Le Corbusier, Mies, all of them. They don't talk about the Spanish. Well, the Spanish is not Spanish. You're from Barcelona, right? They call it the Spanish flu. It's American. He originated in Kansas. Now they call the COVID the Chinese virus. But, the reality is that thing of calling the Spanish flu is completely ridiculous, because it originated in Kansas. It was because of the movements of troops to Europe that it arrived in France. Spain was not even taking part in the war, which is the reason why it's called the Spanish flu. Because there was a lot of censorship in the United States and in Europe because of the war. You couldn't say anything negative. So, of course, people were dying from the flu, but you couldn't say anything negative, so nobody reported it. In Spain, they have not entered the war. They start saying in the newspapers, okay, there is a flu going around that is killing a lot of people. So it became known as the Spanish flu. But the interesting thing is that it was erased from the memory of everybody, right? Something that went on for 2 years, etc., etc. So COVID may go very well for 2 years, and it becomes this nightmare that we live through, but that we don't talk about. I don't know. This depends a lot on how long we are here and what effects does it have in our lives. There's a lot of speculation, but it's short-term speculation. Offices where you put panels, and I mean, like, okay, yeah, sure, this is normal, but it's not very. It's much bigger than that, right?
Much bigger, yeah. Yeah, and I think you're right. I think there will be partially sort of a virtual world that we keep using. And I think there's definitely some benefits also came out of it, not to say this was not serious, but, from all the negative and painful things, we also learned some really positive things and had to adapt. And I see more than a stream one way, like everyone leaves the city. I noticed that everyone's rethinking something, right. and that might be really interesting. And that maybe it is partially architectural, partially urban, maybe, or hopefully social, right? Hopefully this will actually reveal a lot of social inequity and start to balance society in a much more deep level.
Right. In fact, after the major crisis in the history of humanity, we have moved on to a new world. And I think this is the opportunity, right? We can cross into this new world with all our baggage, all the problems that we had before, or we can decide to move on into a completely different reality in which we don't devastate the planet to the extent that we were doing it, that we are more caring towards each other, etc., etc. And if this is what comes out of it, then, well, maybe it would have been a good thing.
Yeah, exactly. Well, thank you so much, Beatriz.
Thank you,
fabulous evening. You had a very international audience.
Great.
And I want to thank everyone for joining. I think at some point we had close to 220 people sitting there listening to you. Wow. So it was quite amazing. And I hope to see you very, very soon.
Yeah, me too.
In person.
In person, yes.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.